Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Quandra Spades, and on behalf of Help One Save One, I would like to introduce today's guest, the one and only Amara Enyia, who will be discussing economic empowerment and how the lack thereof affects our communities. Before we continue, I would first like to thank our viewers for taking time to tune in to our live interactive show here on CAN-TV 21. Thank you for joining us. We would like to also encourage you to please call in. You can call in to 312-738-1060. Once again, I'm going to just quickly show that Help One Save One is a community-inspired organization. One of our main objectives is to educate and empower the community with information designed to inform and enlighten. So please email all your questions to helponesaveone@hotmail.com. You can also call us at 312-313-6977. Last week we discussed education and how its mismanagement has affected the Black community. And if you didn't see the show, please check it out on YouTube. As I mentioned in our last three shows, we have established that the Kerner Commissioner Report will be our foundation to laying the groundwork to support the topics we'll be discussing over the next several weeks. It is our intent to create a progressive series of informative discussions regarding our journey as African Americans, people examining who we once were, where we wanted to be in the past versus where we are today. So with all that said, as I mentioned, I will be discussing economic empowerment in the African American community from the perspective of the Kerner Commissioner Report and what's happened since then. Fast forward, one thing, the report relates to today's topic during the 1968 riots, and I'm sure you've heard of the report, I'm sure. The Commission report wrote that the social and economic conditions in the riot cities constituted a clear pattern of severe disadvantage for Negroes compared with whites, whether the Negroes lived in the area where the riot took place or outside it. Fast forward to 2018, much hasn't changed in 50 years because it seemed like every day on the news we hear about injustices against African Americans, whether it's police brutality, lead, poison water, discrimination in the workplace, being called racial slurs. Yet, Black people in the United States make up one of the biggest consumer markets in the world. Blacks spend about $1 trillion a year. This is huge because our hard-earned dollars are making other people rich, but not us. It's evident that economic empowerment has a major role in our survival as a Black people in America. Therefore, the need for Black people to develop a comprehensive economic and political strategy has become overwhelming and undeniably clear. So with that, I want to jump in. Once again, I want to introduce our guest, Amara Enyia. You have a very impressive and extraordinary bio. I'm very thrilled to share with our community your bio, so if you give me a minute, I would love to do that. Sure. Amara Enyia is a community activist, organizer, lawyer, PhD, Ironman enthusiast who has a passion for public policy. Amara got her start as a journalist. She earned a master's degree in education, law degree where she focused on international and environmental law, and a PhD in educational policy studies. Amara knew she wanted to understand how policies are made at the top level of city government so that she can use her knowledge to serve Chicago's most challenged communities. Excuse me. She's worked in the city hall, and after gaining experience across several policy areas, went straight to the west side of Chicago, God bless her soul, where she served as an executive director of a non-for-profit organization and simultaneously worked full-time in the manufacturing sector. Amara knew she would expand her work to other areas so she launched a municipal consulting firm to help municipalities in the Chicago metropolitan area address some of the most pressing challenges, particularly around economic development and workforce development. Her work has since expanded to neighborhoods around the city, where she acts as a bridge builder and advocate. So with all that being said, we're just going to jump into some questions, Amara. You've mentioned on several platforms regarding cooperative economics and how cooperative economics models are the way to liberate ourselves, so we don't rely on problem systems to provide us access to capital. Can you please share your thoughts on this for our viewers?
Sure. So a lot of what I've been talking about is work that's actually has been years in the making. So this idea of cooperative economic models has, I think, reached reached a tipping point, whereas several years ago was something that was fairly new, that people were not familiar with. And the whole premise behind it is about how do we democratize work, how do we empower people by creating avenues to ownership, as well as how do we rebuild the fabric of community. And so cooperative economic models are all about maximizing collective impact. With worker-owned cooperatives, it's a situation where it's an environment where the employees are actually the owners of the company. So if you have 10 employees, for example, own a gas station, they're the employees, but they're also the owners. What that means is that they determine what their salaries will be. They determine what their working conditions will be, everything from paid sick days to vacation time. They also determine the quality of life and the quality of work. And so they have a much larger stake in the success of the company. And what it does is it also eliminates the exploitative factor that we often see in traditional business models, where you have, particularly in larger corporations, where there's a CEO to employee ratio of 300 to 1 as it relates to pay. So the CEO could be making tens of millions of dollars and the employees are making around minimum wage. And so these are models that exist around the country. They are actually the reason why Germany has the strongest economy in the world. They exist in Mondragon, Spain, Emilia-Romagna in Italy, and elsewhere in the United States, but they had not caught hold here in Chicago. And so if we're talking about how to liberate communities and how to create stronger economies in communities, we have to be talking about this, because we know that the traditional models that have been used thus far, as represented in the Kerner Commission, have not worked.
Wonderful. Well, with that being said, I think that's a great model, actually. So there are Black farmers, Black-owned hair care product lines, Black-owned restaurants, Black-owned clothing lines, fitness centers, repairs. I mean, we can go on and on. There seems to be a Black-owned person for just about every business you can think of. And the cooperative economic model isn't a new concept. Is that correct?
It's not, yes,
Okay.
It's not new.
Matter of fact, there have been earlier cooperative economic activities in the Black communities dating back to the 1900s. These included the cooperative in 1901, the Pioneer Cooperative Society in 1919, the Color Merchant of 1927, and the Color Farmers Alliance were all met with some form of resistance, such as withholding supplies, declining loans, and even violence.
Yes.
Cooperative models have been dangerous both physically and emotionally, especially in the African American community as they try to establish these cooperatives. So fast forward where we're being Black in 2018 is just as hurtful and as dangerous. Please explain to our viewers how using a cooperative economic model can survive and grow, given the fact that oppositions in the past have been so strong and ultimately resulting in cooperatives not lasting long.
Yeah, so one of the challenges that has always existed, and the reason why the cooperative models and collective economies and solidarity economy is also another name for it, the solidarity economy, why they existed in the past was because particularly African Americans were excluded from the avenues to capital and excluded from the avenues to being able to start their businesses. So this whole idea of redlining, which is very much real today, but even more so back in the days in which the examples that you gave, they could not get access to traditional bank loans from a bank for all of the reasons why African Americans were excluded from the economy in the past. And so what that meant is they had to rely on each other. They had to pool their own capital collectively to have sufficient funds to start up a business. And so this was about being self-sufficient, recognizing that the systems that are in place, the societal systems in place, are not working to our advantage, even when they attempted to work with those systems and within those systems, whether it was being part of the supply chain or applying for a bank loan or trying to acquire land, they were excluded. And so that meant that they had to rely on themselves to develop their own businesses and use the resources that they had collectively. That was what caused the proliferation of these models to work. And of course, they were met with resistance when they were successful. I mean, you can go back to examples, for example, of Black Wall Street, for example, when you had entire towns that were very self-sufficient, that had everything that they needed, and existed largely in part because they were not able to, they were excluded, or the discrimination or other opposition that they faced when trying to operate within the mainstream. And so it was born out of necessity, but it actually worked. And so in 2018, not much has really changed. You still find individuals, because of the lack of access to building wealth especially building generational wealth, where you don't have $25,000 in an account somewhere to start a business, right? It's a risky endeavor. Or there's still issues with credit. So if you don't have generational wealth, if you have not been participating in the economy long, you may have bad credit, and that prohibits you from being able to obtain a bank loan for an enterprise that you might want to start. So those barriers still exist, and so the model is still very much viable. What the key to this is, we have to diversify the economic ecosystem. We cannot rely simply on the same traditional models because they'll work for some. As you mentioned, there are many black businesses, black-owned businesses and communities. But if we're going to transform economies and really address some of the deep-seated issues that keep generations from acquiring wealth and being self-sufficient, then we have to diversify the economic ecosystem, and that means pushing these cooperative models into the mainstream. And it's worker-owned cooperatives. It's also this idea of land trusts. It's the idea of housing cooperatives, the things that create wealth in a community and create stability and ownership in a community. That's what we have to be focusing our attention on.
Great, wonderful. I've also heard you speak on different occasions, and I've heard you mention this concept of revolving loan funds, which sounds very creative and would be absolutely amazing for our communities to actually get something like that in our communities. Can you expound upon this concept for our viewers?
Sure. So one of the challenges as we are talking about diversifying the economic ecosystem is you have to create the financial products that support those new models. So right now, if you were wanting to launch a cooperative enterprise here, you have to go to perhaps a traditional bank, and they may not be familiar with those models and how to best fund them. So they may offer you a traditional loan. Well, that might not be the best option for you. So in addition to pushing this to heighten awareness about these models, we also have to develop the financial tools that support these models. So it might be a different kind of loan from a traditional business loan, and that loan would recognize what is the risk of a cooperative versus a sole proprietorship. Right? It might be a little bit different. Perhaps the interest rate is a lot lower because it's lower risk because of the level of investment of the other owners in that cooperative enterprise. So one of the ideas that I've talked about a lot is creating a fund, a separate fund, especially in the city, where we can really test this out and push this forward. And that fund would be designated to providing seed capital for cooperative enterprises. Ideally, it could be a grant or a loan, premised upon whether or not the business or the enterprise succeeds. But what it does is it gives an additional incentive for people to step out there and to experiment, and for us to really strengthen cooperative models in the city and push them more into the mainstream. The idea is that perhaps traditional financial institutions would then follow suit and start to create financial products that allow for these models to grow and expand in the city's economy.
Okay, so for example, based on your this model, what happens if someone defaults on the loan and is unable to pay that loan back? How does that impact the community, or how would that impact the city in this concept?
Well, so the first idea is that I believe that the city can and should be at the forefront of innovating and being much more willing to be creative about how we can support a much stronger and much more diverse economy. And so there's always a risk. Traditional banks always take risks when they issue loans, especially to what they consider to be higher risk communities or higher risk individuals. And they have metrics that they use to determine what that risk looks like. What I believe is that the city could be pushed to be a little bit more creative and to be willing to take risks, because the value, the return on the investment is a much stronger, much more diverse economy that is also much more inclusive, to where those who have been traditionally kept out of the economy can now actually participate. As a standard business practice, when
We have a caller.
Oh, we have a caller.
Yeah, we have a caller.
Excellent.
Okay, caller, what's your question, comment?
Hi. I'm interested in learning more about the revolving fund aspect of the plan. And does Amara, Ms. Enyia, does she know of any banks in Chicago that would be a participating lender that would assist Chicagoans, specifically black people? And I'll hang up and listen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. So the loan fund conceptually, it's something that I think the city of Chicago could initiate. So they would actually make an allocation. You can determine whatever that amount is. Maybe it's a $10 million loan fund that's seeded just geared just specifically for cooperative enterprises. So again, this is the city being a leader and being creative and taking the initiative to invest in its economy by creating this separate loan fund. The benefit is that even if because there's always an attrition rate for some businesses that might not succeed, but there will be some that do succeed, and that contributes positively to the economy. So this is about the city taking a leadership role in this. With traditional financial institutions, one of the things that we're doing now, and it's part of why I launched the Institute for Cooperative Economics earlier this year, was because we have to educate those traditional financial institutions, and this is to the caller's point, about how they can create some of these products. Right now, they don't really operate in that space, so they even need to be educated to see how they can develop financial products that can support these economic models. And that's some of the work that we're doing. It's why it's part of what the Institute seeks to do, is educating the public, but also educating city government, state government, educating financial institutions so that they can create products that support these models.
Great. Now, I think the caller mentioned, and I don't know if you have any recommendations now, but banks that you think would benefit from this type of model.
So I think for the traditional financial institutions, your banks, what we found in a lot of the preliminary work that I've been involved in is that community development financial institutions are kind of lower hanging fruit in terms of their willingness to think outside the box, because they recognize, and they're recognizing more so, how important this is to spurring community-based economic development and economic growth. So your CDFIs, which are community development financial institutions, would be like your Chicago Community Loan Fund. And they have more of a community focus, so that's a better place to start than your traditional banks. However, our plan is to address and to educate all financial institutions up and down across the spectrum on these models and how they can better support them.
Okay, great. We have another caller. Caller, what's your question?
My question, good afternoon. My question to Ms. Enyia, you're speaking in regards to upper income levels, and we have a vast majority of people who are unemployed in the grassroots level. How can we get an economic development process for the grassroots level people?
So to the contrary of the caller's point, this is actually geared toward grassroots community development and towards strengthening the economy at the grassroots level. The issue with in the local economy is that it's only those who do have more disposable income that can set aside capital to seed their own business. The whole premise of cooperative economic models is that these are individuals who perhaps don't have access to generational wealth or money from relatives or other access to capital, and so they decide that they want to pool their capital. It's also about creating ownership. Far too often we have individuals who are making, for example, minimum wage and not able to sustain themselves. An example that I'll give just for the caller's benefit is in New York City, the largest cooperative is a home health care company. There's 2,500 employee owners in this company. Typically in home health care, the wages are fairly low. It's about $8.25 an hour. That's the standard. However, in this cooperative, they had set their salaries. They make $25 an hour. They also have much better working conditions in terms of vacation days and sick leave and all of those auxiliary benefits of being able to be decision makers in how they work and in the ways that they work. So this is actually something that across the board can strengthen grassroots, and it pulls folks who've been excluded from the economy into the economy.
Great, that's awesome. The Freedom Quilting Bee is a noteworthy example of the cooperative economics. In the small town of Alabama, African American women formed a cooperative where they supported each other, earned income collectively, and saved enough to buy land and a factory. They also provided daycare, after school services for children and members at the sewing factory. Some even made enough to free themselves from sharecropping. Having the cooperative own its own land gave members its independence. And before I go on to my question, I'm going to speak to a caller. Caller, can you please give us your question or your comment? Thank you for calling in.
Yeah, when you talk about multiple income levels for this program, does it also varies with location where you live at? Because income varies in different locations.
Yes.
Thank you, caller.
So the question is regarding location. So these models can exist anywhere, and they cut across any sector. So anything from cooperative tech companies to your local gas station or your local laundromat. There really are no restrictions as to where they can exist. The work is in getting people onboarded to the concept and then building the infrastructure around it so that these models can thrive. But it's not restricted to geographic location, it's not restricted to salary level or income level, nor is it restricted to sector. You have, as we were just talking about, a food-based cooperative, but we also have the home healthcare company, you have grocery stores that are cooperative, so it cuts across all sectors, all income levels, and all geographies.
Okay, great. It seemed pretty obvious that the security and welfare of Black people depends on controlling our economics and participating in group economics. But what do you think are the challenges for Black people to collectively pool their money and resources together in order to truly create a cooperative economic model where money is circulating in our communities like it does in other communities?
Well, one of the biggest challenges is creating a culture of trust and a culture where we learn to rely on each other. A lot of what we've seen happen over the most recent generations is a lot of the relational components that existed when we talked about it in the early 1900s and some of those earlier models. There was the relational component of communities was much stronger. The fabric of communities was much stronger. And so, especially in most challenged communities, you see that there's a higher transient population. People are really just trying to survive in many cases. And so the knowledge of your neighbors, all of those things that create strong communities, we have to rebuild those elements, and they create an environment of trust where people are willing to go into business together. The other component is just in stressing the importance of community ownership and local ownership. The first rule of community development is always who owns the land. If you don't own the land in your communities, the homes in your communities, the institutions in your communities, then you're much more vulnerable to being displaced. And so in a lot of our communities, particularly in Chicago, there are no avenues to ownership. And so people are being pushed out of their communities as it becomes less affordable. The key for us is we have to think about how do we create more avenues for self-sufficiency, even as we demand from our city government what we're entitled to in terms of investment and in terms of services and so on and so forth. And those are ongoing challenges, but we're recognizing that as according to the Kerner Commission, a lot has not changed.
Right.
In 50 years since 1968, you can see our major corridors have not been invested in, right? And so what are the alternatives? What is the vision? And who can articulate that vision? And how do we build that vision to really address the issues that we're facing?
Okay, great. Well, with that, I know there are some new initiatives in terms of crowdfunding in Illinois. How different is crowdfunding from this cooperative economic model?
So we have been very intentional, especially with the Institute, of casting a broad net when we talk about cooperative models. So we include everything from equity crowdfunding to land trusts, housing co-ops, and even hybrid models, because we wanted to have a space where we are innovating about what economic tools we have to use to transform communities. And so equity crowdfunding, I had the pleasure of being able to work on some statewide legislation that got equity crowdfunding passed so that at the state level it recognizes this as a legitimate tool for investing and for creating businesses. And so that was I think in 2014, 2015, that we were able to do that, and now we're in the process of educating the public, educating business owners on this tool. That's when I say we have to create infrastructure, that's what I mean. At the city level, at the state level, we have to make sure that our laws recognize these models as viable so that when someone wants to start one, they know how to get the appropriate license. They know what ordinances govern the business that they're trying to create, and there are a set of policies in place that can help them as they navigate that process. And so the equity crowdfunding legislation and its passage was a big win for us because, again, it's another avenue for people who might not want a traditional business, but want to own a business and want to own it collectively with other folks.
Okay, great job on that.
Thank you.
Well, I would like to thank my guest, Amara Enyia, the one and only. I think this is a very interesting topic. Economic empowerment, cooperative economic models within our community, how that's going to strengthen our communities and hopefully be able to be a job creator and allow us to be able to take ownership in our business and in our community. Next week we will be discussing police brutality. Gentrification. If you have any additional questions or comments, please visit our Facebook page, or email us at help1say1@hotmail.com. Once again, thank you so much, Amara. It was such a pleasure, such an honor to be sitting here with you today. And
Likewise.
we look forward to you all tuning in next week at 5:30. Thank you. Ciao.